You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, everybody, welcome to episode 8 of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today, we're going to be looking at why good arguments should be based on ideas and not based solely on the personality of the person that we are arguing with. In other words, we should try to focus in debates, both as Protestants and as libertarians, on the ideas that are actually being discussed instead of on the character flaws that we perceive in the person that we are having the conversation with. And I think we're going to look at why that is so significant and so important today. So the media obviously cares much more about personality than it does about ideas. And I'm not going to point my fingers at a particular branch or a particular wing of the media. This is both a left-wing and a right-wing phenomenon. It does not matter which media outlets you generally listen to or that you generally consume in the mainstream. It's just a matter of fact that much of the left-right media in our country focuses only on how bad the other side is. And the problem with this is that a lot of these media outlets, they don't so much make positive arguments for their social or political values as they do criticize the flaws in those views that they don't hold. So they're not making a case that their particular political or social philosophy is correct. Rather, they try to make the case that the people that are on the other side of the argument are somehow flawed or corrupt. I mean, you can see this on both Fox and CNN. It's extremely obvious every time you watch either of those networks, and we don't have cable at my house, so generally I see CNN when I'm out at a store, and I see Fox when I go over to friends and family's house. But with both of these, as well as all of the print news media that out there that aligns with the political perspectives of Fox and CNN, obviously Fox is geared towards a conservative audience and CNN is geared towards a liberal audience, no matter what Don Lemon says about the objectivity of their network. They often resort to hit pieces and personal attacks against those with whom they disagree, and the whole purpose of that is to try to malign the opposition. So again, instead of making a principled argument for your own values, instead of trying to explain to the world why conservatism is the best approach to politics, or why liberalism is the best approach, not liberalism in the classical sense, but liberal progressivism in the modern sense, why progressivism is the best form of politics, instead of making a principled argument for those values, instead, they mostly just attack and criticize people that are different than them. And they're not even really criticizing their arguments. They're criticizing people for perceived character traits or perceived character flaws that they think their opponents might have. And this was extremely obvious throughout the Trump administration. If you remember back to just like a year and a half ago, I mean, this was kind of like the mainstream take. And there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that believe that the average person that voted for Trump is like a racist, or that the average Trump voters are just kind of like stupid and ignorant hillbillies that don't know anything and that don't have a college education and all of that kind of stuff. Regardless of the polling data that we have for people that voted for Trump, there was just this perception out there in the media that anyone that voted for Trump necessarily had to be stupid or racist or morally deficient. And even some of my good friends who are a little more liberal, I remember having a conversation with a very good friend of mine where she thought that we hadn't really talked about politics, and she thought that I might be a Trump voter. And when I told her that I was a libertarian, she's like, "Well, that's good, because I thought you were like one of those smart people, unlike the other ones that voted for Trump." And it's just like, even this is from a very intelligent person, but that consumes a lot of left-wing news outlet media content, and she just made the assumption based on what she had been heard that if you voted for Trump, you had to be an idiot. And again, Fox News does the exact same thing. And I could name drop a couple of Republican politicians, and I won't, at least not right now. But if you look at kind of the Fox News or the conservative wing of the media, all of these people think that if you're a liberal, even if you're kind of like an old school 1960s, we think there should be welfare state kind of liberal, they're always portrayed as like these radical Marxists and that they just deny reality. And again, it's always goes back to the fact that their opponents are stupid or ignorant. Now, it is true that ignorant racists voted for Trump. I know some of the ignorant racists that voted for Trump. I'm friends with some of the ignorant racists that voted for Trump. Also, there were plenty of ignorant quasi-Marxists that voted for Biden. And again, I'm friends with some of the ignorant quasi-Marxists that voted for Biden. But most of the people that are in those are in those groups are on the extremes. Like the majority, your average Trump voter and your average Biden voter are just normal Americans with mostly centrist views that don't really understand the kind of the philosophical extremes of either political perspective, because they don't need to, because it shouldn't matter, and because in reality most people spend their life worrying more about how they're going to take care of their family and work their job and see their friends than they do about stupid political infighting. But I do want to place the blame today on the media, because in a lot of ways the media is responsible for presenting the ideas of the fringes on each or in each party or in each political movement as if they represent the mainstream. In other words, the truly racist person who supports Trump because they think that Trump is a racist is often well represented on TV, as well as the liberals who are protesting and breaking windows and things like that in these racial riots around the country. They're often portrayed as if that is the norm. And based on the statistics and based on the polling data, that's just not the case. There are a lot of liberals that would never, ever even protest, much less destroy a building or burn a car or anything like that. And there are a lot of conservatives that are not racist whatsoever and that are actually well-educated people and that have real intellectual reasons for believing what they believe. The problem, again, with the way that the media presents a lot of these people is that they are deliberately trying to misrepresent what the majority of Americans who aren't actually radicalized believe. And I think it makes sense that controversy and dissension and hatred sells when people feel like there is a challenge out there or a fight out there. When people feel like there's some sort of perceived injustice, they're going to tune in and they're going to watch TV. Again, you just have to look at the ratings of CNN before Trump and after Trump. CNN's ratings were incredibly high during the Trump administration because they could attack Trump and they could stir up a lot of emotion and a lot of antagonism, and that gets people to tune in and watch watch their news networks. Whereas when Biden took office and CNN took a much more softer approach to the Biden administration, their viewership dropped because they weren't able to kind of manipulate the anger of people that were watching them. I think the big picture here for our purposes today, though, is if you take a look at what's actually happening, all of this kind of media representation of the politics in the United States is done basically without making any sort of positive empirical argument for your own values or beliefs. Like, you're not going to hear news anchors on CNN give an analytical or empirical assessment of progressivism. Why is it that they think that progressive politics, where the government is involved in the economy and so forth, why is it they think that that's the best political arrangement in the United States? And conversely, if you watch Fox News or any of the other right-wing media outlets, you're not often going to get positive arguments for their own values or beliefs. Why do conservatives believe in conservatism? Like, you don't get a lot of that stuff, and it's because that's not what a lot of people want to see when they watch TV. The unfortunate reality is that cable news and a lot of these print media outlets are more about entertaining their customers. Again, it has to do with supply and demand. There's a high demand for emotional kind of entertainment sort of news than actual philosophical, analytical sort of news. And so they're going to provide the former to their customer in order to get more watches, more likes, more clicks, more downloads, and all of those things. Now, it's very obvious, too, that style of argument absolutely pervades social media. If you get on social media Everyone has a voice, for better or for worse. And again, I'm a free speech absolutist. I believe that you should be able to get on social media if you want and say whatever you want to say. But if you look at the way that people argue on social media, and this is one of the reasons why I currently don't have a social media account for this podcast, and why I do technically have a Facebook page and a personal Facebook page and a personal Twitter page, but they're deactivated. I only really activate my Facebook page when I need to sell stuff on Marketplace because, as I've said before, it's much safer than Craigslist. But if you look at the way that people argue with each other on social media, it's all style over substance. All that people want to do is provide these pithy statements and slogans, and those have completely replaced any sort of logical or analytical argument. And I would argue that social media, just as a system, as a technology, is not really the right place to have these kinds of nuanced arguments about politics or theology or anything like that. But a lot of people get on social media and just argue with each other all the time. And again, based on my experience on social media, is one of the reasons I started tuning out a few years ago. People don't make a positive argument for their beliefs. They just want to attack the beliefs of other people. And many people, I think, unfortunately, just because of the media environment that we live in, many people really do believe that those with whom they disagree are morally or intellectually inferior. Like, we've been taught to believe that if someone doesn't agree with us, it's because they're stupid, it's because they're intellectually deficient, it's because they haven't thought about the issues as deeply as we have. But that's oftentimes not the case. And in my experience, there are a lot of people out there that are incredibly intelligent that are just trying to figure it out. And life is extremely hard to understand. And so today we're going to look at why I think, again, good arguments should be about ideas and not about personality. Now, it's really unfortunate because the mentality that I just outlined in popular discourse on politics is often, unfortunately, true, and maybe sometimes even worse within the Christian tradition. And so biblical scholars, even biblical scholars that have PhDs and that write incredibly good books and research papers on the Bible, they often resort to personality attacks as well. And so there's been a big debate within New Testament scholarship since really the kind of mid to late 1970s over the degree to which Paul should be understood within Judaism. And so there are kind of three main camps: the traditional perspective on Paul, which kind of upholds the classical Lutheran and Reformed understanding of Paul; the new perspective on Paul, which tries to understand what Paul does and says within the context of Second Temple Judaism; and then the radical new perspective on Paul, which we're not going to talk about much in today's show, but we will on a future episode, which tries to locate Paul completely within Second Temple Judaism and redefine a lot of the traditional theological categories that we use when trying to interpret the letters of Paul in the New Testament. And just to put a marker down here, I am somewhere in between the new and the radical new perspective on Paul. So I'm not a traditionalist or anything like that, but I learned a lot back in college and after I graduated about Paul and about his epistles by reading these works that were written by either traditional perspectivists, people that have kind of an old school Protestant perspective on Paul, and the new perspective on Paul, which is represented by scholars like N.T. Wright and James Dunn and E.P. Sanders, all men who have written incredibly important and persuasive books on reinterpreting Paul within his Second Temple Jewish context. And so some of those debates were extremely lively. Very famously, N.T. Wright had an excellent book called Justification that he wrote in response to a traditionalist, John Piper, who wrote a book. I can't remember what John Piper's book was named. I read it, and if I can remember, The Future of Justification, I think was John Piper's book's name, where he was just arguing against the new perspective on Paul and trying to reinforce the traditional perspective on Paul. And so N.T. Wright wrote a very learned response to John Piper, did not criticize him personally. So Piper and Wright had this debate, and while I definitely think Wright was more correct, they were very respectful in the way that they engaged with one another. And I think that was an excellent example of how New Testament scholars can have radically different ideas about fundamental theological issues without resorting to personality attacks. Again, a lot of respect to John Piper and a lot of respect to Tom Wright for having that very famous debate in print in the late in the late 2000s. But then again, as I've said on this podcast before, whenever I'm reading a book or studying a particular issue, I get online and I try to find podcasts that help me understand whatever it is I'm reading. And again, a lot of it's, you can put it on in the car. When I work out in the morning, I can turn on a podcast and learn a little bit about what I'm going to read. It gets me thinking about it before I read the book or read the article. And I came across, and it is really good, but I came across a podcast series by a traditional perspectivist on Paul, D.A. Carson, who's, I think, a very famous Reformed scholar. And I'm going to put the links to his podcast series on there because he does have a 3-part history of the new perspective on Paul. It is extremely polemical, and it definitely comes from an anti-new perspective. An anti-new perspective. That's where it comes from there. It does give a great overview of the history of the new perspective on Paul, but D.A. Carson resorts to a lot of personal attacks on James Dunn and N.T. Wright in particular in there, and I was really put off by that. As I was listening to his podcast, again, he has good information about what these two scholars believe, and he compares their perspective with his traditionalist view and other traditionalists like him in some really helpful ways. But he resorts to a lot of kind of, I think, mean and underhanded personal attacks on both James Dunn and Tom Wright. And I think he falls into the trap that a lot of Protestants fall into, is that they moralize these theological disagreements. So D.A. Carson suggests at the end of one of these podcasts that Tom Wright in particular might be sinning for disagreeing with the traditional perspective on justification or something like that. And I don't want to misrepresent Carson's point of view there. You can fact check me by listening to it yourself. But this has always been a problem within Christianity. And again, we talked about creeds a few weeks ago, and I think that this goes back to that orthodoxy heresy dynamic that was created by the creeds in the early church, where in Christianity, people with whom you disagree, at least from a certain perspective, you don't just think that they're wrong, but you think that they're sinful or morally evil. And again, like, this is kind of one of the flaws in D.A. Carson's thinking in this podcast series on the new perspective on Paul, is he makes a suggestion that because Wright and Dunn disagree with him, that they may be sinning or that they may be morally evil. And there's a lot of animosity within Christianity, especially if you look at all of the different denominations of Protestantism. There are a lot of Christians that think that because other Christians have a different perspective on an issue like justification or the definition of faith or on whether or not Genesis was actually history, they believe that Christians that don't agree with them are somehow morally deficient or morally evil. And again, the animosity between so many Protestants and Catholics is based on this assumption that there are a lot of Catholics that think that us Protestants are just irredeemable heretics, and there are a lot of Protestants that return that belief, that shoot it right back at the Catholics there. And again, the problem with this is that you don't have to make a principled argument for your theological beliefs if you can demonstrate that your opponent is somehow morally evil or inferior. And I think this is the reason why a lot of Christians are hesitant to take any sort of theological or political or historical advice from those that are not a part of the church. They think that if you're not a Christian, that somehow your mind is deficient, somehow your mind is corrupted, somehow your mind is evil, and there's nothing that you can learn from them. But again, a lot of the scholarship that I've been reading over the last few years, particularly on economics, is written from a non-Christian perspective, but it doesn't make it any less correct. Like, it doesn't make it any less right. It doesn't make it any less factual just because the person who's articulating these ideas does not share my fundamental values, my fundamental beliefs, or my fundamental worldview. Someone can be right, even if I think that they're a bad person. Or alternatively, someone can be right even if they just have a different set of values than I do, and I don't think that makes somebody a bad person. So that opens up the door then to the question that we need to, I think, address. How should, if you're a Christian or if you're a Protestant, how should we go about arguing with other people with whom we disagree? Now, I love a good polemicist. It's one of the reasons why I love a lot of the people that are kind of on the anarcho-capitalist side of libertarianism Libertarianism, Tom Woods, Dave Smith. Murray Rothbard is fantastic. He has an excellent collection of essays from the early 1990s called The Irrepressible Rothbard. Fantastic. He's an excellent polemicist. It's so much fun to read. But these guys do engage in a lot of personal attacks. Now, they make extremely positive and analytical cases for their libertarian beliefs, and I have a lot of respect for them for that. But because they are not Protestants, I don't think that they feel like making those personal attacks is necessarily wrong. And again, if you don't have the Protestant worldview, then personal attacks do make sense from a certain perspective. It's also, I'm gonna say this up front before we get into taking a look at a couple of passages from the Bible here that I think we ought to take into consideration. It's very easy to resort to personal attacks when you are frustrated. And I'm going to go ahead and make a confession here. In the Protestant church, we don't have confessional, so I guess I'll use this podcast to air my sins out to the world. But for most of the COVID pandemic, I was pretty calm about everything, and I was very frustrated about the way that the government was handling the crisis. And as a public school teacher, I thought that we just systematically failed our kids from top to bottom in our response to COVID right now. But I was pretty calm about it, and going into the summer of 2021, before we started last school year, we in Kentucky started loosening our mask policies. We thought that our kids were going to be able to go back to school without having to wear a mask. I thought that I was going to finally be able to teach after a year without a mask on in my classroom, and I was really excited about that. And when we started our training at the beginning of the year, we were all back in the building. Almost everyone was mask free, and we were very respectful. Like, if you wanted to wear a mask, wear a mask. It's not, I don't care if someone wants to wear a mask. If that's what makes them feel comfortable, by all means, go for it. But I was excited that my daughter wasn't going to be forced to wear a mask to school, and I was excited that I wasn't going to be forced to wear a mask to school. And then our governor, Andy Brashear, whom I've said a lot of very mean things about over the last couple of years in a very uncharitable and unchristian kind of way, decided that all of the public schools, based on the CDC's evidence, and those of you guys that are here from the libertarian perspective, kind of where I'm headed with this, they decided that we all needed to wear masks again. So we had already been in all of these training sessions surrounded by hundreds of other teachers without masks on, and then they decided that we all had to wear masks in school. So I was extremely frustrated by that, and that was really the thing that set me off. And I had tried to avoid doing a lot of research on COVID and everything like that because I just didn't want to get frustrated. I just wanted to ride it out and kind of move on with my life. But that really broke me, and I'm going to be honest with you guys on this show. Like, I spent almost all of last school year just being absolutely pissed off about the fact that we had to wear a mask, that our district would go back and forth on the numbers, and we'll be able to take our masks off when we have a certain number of people to get vaccinated, and we have to wait for the guidance of the CDC. And there was a lot of debate and discussion among the professionals that I work with at school about whether or not we needed to have the mask mandates and everything like that. And I'm going to be honest, I was really, really angry about it all year long. And I did and said a lot of things that I regret. And I realized, I got COVID back in February. It wasn't that big of a deal. But I remember being stuck in my basement basically because I was trying not to infect my wife and ruin her entire week of work. I remember being stuck in my basement and just thinking I have been so angry about this, and I've resorted to a lot of personal attacks, and I just kind of praying about it, and I realized that I needed an attitude change because I had really let this COVID stuff kind of eat away at me. And that got me thinking about how easy it is when you're frustrated to resort to personal attacks. Now, again, I was studying COVID. I was more informed about it and about the government's failed response to COVID than ever before. And I spent a lot of time listening to podcasts and reading books and reading articles trying to figure out why we had gone so far off the rails with COVID, both in our state and then from a bigger perspective in our country. And so I was informed, but it was just because I was so angry about it, it was much easier for me to resort to ad hominem personal attacks on other people. And I started losing respect, and this was not fair for them, but I started losing respect for other people in my life that disagree with me, and that was the wrong approach for me as a Christian. And so as we go through these passages today, where I think there are two passages in particular where the writers of the New Testament really force us to think about how we use our words to encourage or build up other people. This is directed at me as much as it's directed at anyone else. I can sit here and talk about how the mainstream media has made everybody angry and made everybody frustrated, but I was last year for much of of the school year, I was just as much a part of this problem as anyone else because I was mad and I was frustrated and I did not handle it in a very responsible or analytical sort of way. So the two passages that really help me think about how we should go about arguing with others who disagree with us from a Protestant perspective. The first one is James chapter 3, and this is verses 3 through 12. And I'm going to read this here, and we're going to talk about the significance of it. But James says this. He says, "Do not become teachers in large numbers, my brothers, since you know that we who are teachers will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to rein in the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we will direct their whole body as well. Look at the ships, too. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are nevertheless directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot determines. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things." And this is where I really love what he says here. "See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our body's parts as that which defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one among mankind can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, these things should not be this way. Does a spring send out from the same opening both fresh water and bitter? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, bear olives, or a vine bear figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh." So James, as I argued last week, is probably one of the earliest books, if not, or probably one of the earliest letters, if not the earliest letter to be written in the New Testament. Again, that's a minority position with the New Testament scholarship, but I hold it for reasons that I would love to discuss on a later show. And James is obviously Jewish. He's the brother of Jesus, and he discusses the ramifications of faith within the Jewish wisdom tradition. And I think that he is writing to the church in Jerusalem, which is a almost exclusively Jewish church who would have been very familiar with the wisdom tradition of, say, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. And one of the points that he makes here is that what we say controls what we think, and he deals with this reality. And verses 8 through 10, I think, are kind of the centerpiece of this, where he says that with our tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who have been made in the image and likeness of God. And so James goes back to the reality of Genesis 1:26 and 27, which is the foundation for biblical anthropology. It's the foundation for the way that the writers of the Bible understand who we are as people, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And James says that it is inconsistent for someone who believes in Christ to praise God and to curse men. And again, he's not saying that we can't argue or disagree with someone. He's not saying that we shouldn't have strong opinions and forcefully articulate those opinions in public. But what he is saying is that we shouldn't try to make any of those arguments personal, because our interlocutors, our conversation partners, are created in God's image and likeness. And this is the reality here. Like, if you're a Christian, the person that you think might be the worst person in the world, or the dumbest person in the world, or the person with whom you disagree with the most, is created in the image and likeness of God, just like you. Again, James goes back to Genesis 1:26 and 27 there and kind of makes this the centerpiece of his argument. The tongue can take us to places that we don't want to go. Again, if we continue to say and do bad, if we continue to say and do critical, negative, destructive things, then we're going to become more critical, negative, destructive people, and that takes us further and further away from the idea that people are created in God's image and likeness. And if we want to use our words properly, if we want to use what we say properly, then we have to understand that every person that we have a conversation with, every person that we come into contact with, is made in God's image and likeness. Now, Paul is going to make a very similar argument in Ephesians 4, and this is verses 29 through 31. So Paul says, "Let no unwholesome word come out of your mouth, but if there is any good word for edification according to the need of the moment, say that, so that it will give grace to those who hear. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. All bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and slander must be removed from you, along with all malice." Now, in the book to the Ephesians, in the letter to the Ephesians, Paul has already defined the church as the united Jew plus Gentile community of those that have accepted the gospel. And then he spends a lot of time in the second half of the letter explaining kind of the practical and moral consequences of the decision to follow the gospel and what results from a united Jew-Gentile church. And in verse 17, he explicitly contrasts, in verse 17 in Ephesians, to go back to that, he explicitly contrasts the behavior that the united Jew-Gentile church is supposed to have with those of the outsiders. And he actually uses the term Gentile, which from a Jewish perspective means someone that is non-Jewish. He now uses that term Gentile to apply to anyone that has not accepted the gospel. And the idea here is that Christians, people that believe in Jesus, should use their words differently than those that do not believe in Jesus. That the purpose of our speech, according to Paul, should be the edification or the building up of other people. And again, I think for our purposes today, this means that even when we disagree with someone, even when we think that somebody is wrong and we have a debate or an argument with them, our argument should be made in a way that attempts to build up those with whom we disagree. Because it doesn't matter how much you disagree with someone, they are still, according to James, created in the image and likeness of God, and it is still our responsibility, according to Paul, to edify or to build up those with whom we are in conversation. We should be using our words, using our language, using our speech, using our platforms to attempt to build other people up, which means, I think, from the argumentative perspective, from a debating kind of perspective, we need to make arguments that focus on the ideas that we are trying to communicate rather than attacking the character of somebody else. Again, if you are a Christian, you have to keep two things in mind about human beings. One goes back to Genesis 1:26 and 27, that all people are made in the image and likeness of God and given the responsibility of wisely ruling or owning this creation that God has made. And then there's Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but are justified freely as a gift through the faith which is in Christ Jesus. And I think we have to remember those two things, that we are all equally sinful and guilty before God, and we all need the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, but we're all equally made in God's image and likeness. And again, from a Protestant perspective, we have to try to focus on building other people up with our arguments and with our platforms instead of tearing them down. And this is one of the ways that I think that Protestants can learn to argue better. Again, we have to remember that everyone is created in the image and likeness of God. I've said it a lot, but this is a central point in the New Testament that's often overlooked, and that our words should be used to build others up. Again, James in James chapter 3 says essentially the same thing, that we have to use our language to build other people up. And if we continue to use words in a way that's polemical and that attacks and antagonizes and tear down other people, it is completely inconsistent with what we believe as Christians. And again, I love the analogy there. About fresh water coming from a fresh spring, and about how a small spark can set a large forest on fire. Again, it's the idea that if you're sincere in your faith, then your words need to back that up, even when you're in public, even when you're debating, even when you're having arguments. And that if you don't watch your tongue, if you don't try to watch your tongue, worry about what you say, and make sure that you're saying things to edify other people, that you can destroy your life that way. And I think the mainstream media is an excellent example of how a very small spark can set an extremely large forest on fire. Just a very powerful metaphor, a lot to think about and reflect upon there. We should also, again, focus entirely on the ideas that we disagree with without trying to destroy or malign the character of other people. I've said on this show before that it's important to read Karl Marx. It's important to read Vladimir Lenin. It's important to read and listen to people that don't have your perspective so that you can understand why they think the way that they do and have a healthy, productive, intellectual conversation with them. And again, you also need to understand the presuppositions of your own worldview. We should focus both both as Protestants and as libertarians on presenting our ideas, which I think are intellectually rock solid, to the world without trying to destroy or malign the character of other people. And are there bad actors out there? Are there people that act in bad faith? Absolutely. And will we criticize some of those people on this show? Yes. But the goal of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast is to focus on big ideas that relate to Protestantism and libertarianism and make a positive case for those ideas. This isn't going to be a podcast where I deliberately try to put people down or anything like that. That's just not the goal of the show. Again, this puts a big responsibility on us to make a positive argument for our ideas. This doesn't mean that we can't use irony. It doesn't mean that we can't be funny. It doesn't mean that we can't use comedy to criticize ideas or thinkers that we don't like or disagree with. But we as Christians have an obligation to try to do so in a way that is humanizing, that emphasizes the point that everyone, even the people that we are most in radical disagreement with, are created in God's image and likeness, and that stays focused on the argument that's at hand. Again, going back to what Paul says in Romans chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but are justified freely by the grace which is a gift within Christ Jesus. All right, so even the worst people, the people that we think are the worst, are not beyond redemption. And again, as Christians, the idea that there are people out there, as Protestants at least, the idea that there are people out there that are somehow morally inferior to us is just completely antithetical to the teaching of the New Testament there. Again, this the concepts that we're talking about in this episode today is going to hit me just as hard as I hope it hits some of you guys. These are the things that, as I've reflected about the very inappropriate and unfortunate ways that I allowed the COVID conversations to make me an angry, cynical person, and the way that I experienced what James talked about, like the way that anger and cynicism manifested itself in my personal relationships over the last year. It's real. If you choose to be negative, if you choose to attack people, if you choose to think that you're superior to the people that are in your life, then you're going to necessarily put strain and damage on your relationships, and it's going to be inconsistent with your values as a Christian. And for me, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned over the last year, because it's probably the angriest I've been as an adult about issues that were outside of my control, is that it does compromise your ability to effectively share the gospel with other people. If I'm always angry about the way that I feel like our state government or the federal government screwed me and my family over, and that's all that I talk about at work or with my friends or with my family, then that takes away from my ability to both live out my faith in a consistent manner and to share the gospel with them, which is the thing that as a Christian I should be focused on more than anything else. And so that's the kind of the way that I want to reflect on this. Now, to close out the show today, I want to read a passage from one of my favorite philosophers, Michel Foucault. I read kind of an anthology of his work back in the fall, and he has a section on polemics where he's in this anthology. It's I think Rabinal was the editor. Obviously, Foucault died in I think the mid to late 1980s. But it's a collection of excerpts from Foucault's work and a collection of interviews that were done with Foucault. And in one of these interviews, he was asked about why he doesn't try to engage in polemics, why he avoids trying to make attacks on other people personal, and why he avoids trying to tear down other people personally. And I think Michel Foucault gives an excellent answer to this. Again, one of my favorite philosophers. I think he's very much misunderstood, and I would highly recommend, if you're interested in any sort of philosophical ideas, to pick up a copy of the Foucault Reader by Paul, or edited by Paul Rabinal. But I'm going to read, to wrap up the show today, an excerpt from Foucault about polemics and about why Foucault does not engage in them. And so his interviewer asked him the question here, why is it that you don't engage in polemics? And this is going to be a longer-ish answer here, so I'm going to read for a minute or two, but every single word of Foucault's answers here is fantastic and relates back to, from a philosophical perspective, the issues we've been discussing on today's show. So Michel Foucault answers the question about why he doesn't engage in polemics this way. He says, I I like discussions, and when I am asked questions, I try to answer them. It's true that I don't like to get involved in polemics. If I open a book and see that the author is accusing an adversary of infantile leftism, for example, I shut it again right away. That's not my way of doing things. I don't belong to the world of people who do things that way. I insist on this difference as something essential. A whole morality is at stake, the morality that concerns the search for truth and the relation to the other. In the serious play of questions and answers and the work of reciprocal elucidation, the rights of each person are in some sense immanent in the discussion. They depend only on the dialogue situation. The person asking the question is merely exercising the right that has been given to him to remain unconvinced, to perceive a contradiction, to require more information, to emphasize different postulates, to point out faulty reasoning, etc. As for the person answering the questions, he too exercises a right that does not go beyond the discussion itself. By the logic of his own discourse, he is tied to what he has said earlier, and by the acceptance of dialogue, he is tied to the questioning of the other. Questions and answers depend on a game that is at once pleasant and difficult, in which each of the two partners takes pains to use only the rights given him by the other and by the accepted form of the dialogue. The polemicist, on the other hand, proceeds encased in privileges that he possesses in advance and will never agree to question. On principle, he possesses rights authorizing him to wage war and making that struggle a just undertaking. The person he confronts is not a partner in the search for truth, but an adversary, an enemy who is wrong, who is harmful, and whose very existence constitutes a threat. For him, then, the game does not consist of recognizing this person as a subject having the right to speak, but of abolishing him as interlocutor from any possible dialogue, and his final objective will be not to come as close as possible to a difficult truth, but to bring about the triumph of the just cause he has been manifestly upholding from the beginning. The polemicist relies on a legitimacy that his adversary is by definition denied. I love that. Foucault goes on, perhaps someday a long history will have to be written of polemics. Polemics is a parasitic figure on discussion and an obstacle to the search for the truth. Very schematically, it seems to me that today we can recognize the presence in polemics of three models: the religious model, the judiciary model, and the political model. As in heresiology, polemics sets itself to the task of determining the intangible point of dogma, the fundamental and necessary principle that the adversary has neglected, ignored, or transgressed, and it denounces this negligence as a moral failing. At the root of the error, it finds passion, desire, interest, a whole series of weaknesses and inadmissible attachments that establish it as culpable. As in judiciary practice, polemics allow for no possibility of an equal discussion. It examines a case. It isn't dealing with an interlocutor. It is processing a suspect. It collects the proofs of his guilt, designates the infraction he has committed, and pronounces the verdict and sentences him. In any case, what we have here is not on the order of a shared investigation. The polemicist tells the truth in the form of his judgment and by virtue of the authority he has conferred on himself. But it is the political model that is the most powerful today. Polemics defines alliances, recruits partisans, unites interests or opinions, represents a party. It establishes the other as an enemy and upholder of opposed interest against which one must fight until the moment this enemy is defeated or either surrenders or disappears. Of course, the reactivation in polemics of these political, judiciary, or religious practices is nothing more than theater. One gesticulates. Anathemas, excommunications, condemnations, battles, victories, and defeats are no more than ways of speaking, after all. And yet, in the order of discourse, they are also ways of acting which are not without consequence. There are the sterilizing effects. Has anyone ever seen a new idea come out of a polemic? And how could it be otherwise, given here that the interlocutors are incited not to advance, not to take more and more risk in what they say, but to fall back continually on the right that they claim, on their legitimacy, which they must defend, and on the affirmation of their innocence? There is something even more serious here. In this comedy, one mimics war, battles, annihilations, or unconditional surrenders, putting forward as much of one's killer instinct as possible. But it is really dangerous to make anyone believe that he can gain access to the truth by such paths, and just thus to validate, even if in a merely symbolic form, the real political practices that could be warranted by it. Let us imagine for a moment that a magic wand is waved and one of the two adversaries in a polemic is given the ability to exercise all the power he likes over the other. One doesn't even have to imagine it. One only has to look at what happened during the debates in the USSR over linguistics statistics or genetics not long ago. Were these merely aberrant deviations from what was supposed to be the correct discussion? Not at all. They were the real consequences of a polemic attitude whose effects ordinarily remain suspended. Foucault sounded very similar to James chapter 3 there. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, guys, that's going to do it for this week. Again, if you have any questions or comments for me, please feel free to email me. This was a little bit different. It was a little more of a freewheeling episode this week. I try to plan out a lot of this stuff ahead of time, and I did have a basic structure for the episode, but as I was talking and thinking through my episode outline today, I realized a lot of things that I wanted to address. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and this is going to be something that we're going to come back to a lot on this show, the idea that we're going to stay focused on the ideas, we're going to stay focused on the principles, we're going to stay focused on worldview. We're going to stay focused on all the things that help provide us with a productive conversation and not just resort to personal attacks. Next week, we got a great show. We're going to be looking at this book that I just read recently called Who is an Evangelical by Thomas Kidd. Very exciting. It details the history of the evangelical movement in the U.S., how it became increasingly political and identified with the Republican Party, and whether or not this branch of Protestantism has a future. So there is a lot in this book that is relevant to both the Protestant movement in the United States and libertarianism more generally. So I'm extremely excited about having that conversation next week. Again, as always, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you could get on iTunes or whatever service you use for your podcast and subscribe to the show, give me a star review rating, give me a review, that would be incredibly helpful getting this podcast out there. Thanks again, guys, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to reach out to me about suggestions for future shows, you can contact me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. That's theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.